I want to start by kind of reeling back into the first adventure you can remember as a child, as a young adult, or was it in your 30s?
I think the big moments came for me in terms of, I guess, some of the things I've done in the last 10 to 12 years was a consequence of something that happened in my life, and I just didn't remember the date. It was the 7th of May, 2009. It was exactly 2 weeks after my first child was born. And at the time I was working in the city, and it was right in the height of the credit crisis. So it was sort of post-subprime crisis, and Lehman Brothers had gone out of business, and all the central banks around the world were, cutting interest rates dramatically. And I traded European sovereign debt, and so all eyes were on the European Central Bank. I made a significant error in my decision making, and only 3 people on the planet know this story. I
brought down Lehman Brothers.
I lost everything, and in a matter of moments, seconds, and not only did I lost everything of my own, but other people's as well. And I remember walking home from the city to my home in Putney, which is about 8 miles, because I just needed to collect my thoughts before I got home. And I got home, and I had no sense of time. And when I got home, and nobody was in, and I sat down on an armchair in the window, and then my wife came in with her mother, my mother-in-law, and our newborn child. And she was really excited because she'd just been to the town hall to register the birth of our son, our first child. And she looked at me and said, "Well, what are you doing at home? What it's like 3:30 in the afternoon. Why are you here?" And I said, I've not had a great day. I need to take a moment, sort of thing. And anyway, she said, well, what's happened? You need to tell me what's happened. And I said, look, it's fine. Don't worry about it. I'm going to sort it out. Anyway, she walked off into the kitchen, and I followed her, and she started to breastfeed Charlie, our child. And she looked at me and said, Ian, you're going to have to tell me what's happened. So I told her what happened, and she welled up, and she looked at me, and she said, don't worry, it's going to be fine. And that's the last time we'd ever spoke about it. And the reason I'm telling you all this is because I'd always had this thing in my mind about where's your quit point? Like, when do you know to give up on something, or when do you know to keep going on? And I think I had this belief that unless life or death depends on it, then how do you truly know whether you're going to give up on something? How do you truly know whether it's you're quitting, or you're walking away for good reason, or you continue? And I think it was that, what I would consider that life-defining moment, where my life could have gone one of 2 directions. I think I had to frame that moment in a really positive way to enable me to kind of cope with it and overcome it, and make sure that I could provide a future for my family. And I think that was then what triggered this sort of change in my life about going off and doing, really adventurous stuff, because I had this, I suppose, a desire to sort of be a better version of myself, find ways of improving myself, find ways of exploring my physical and emotional and mental capabilities. And more, actually, if nothing else, is a way of coping with the situation that I created. What I didn't want to do is get to the end of my life and look back at that moment and say that was the moment that I screwed things up. That was the moment that I made a bad situation worse. That was the moment that I walked away from responsibilities, or walked away from my commitments, or that was the moment that I just made the wrong decision in life. What I wanted to do is get to the end of my life and look back and say that was the moment that I became a better person. That was the moment that I did some interesting things. That was the moment that actually, if I draw a line back to that point in time, I can see a path that is just one of, positivity and, effectively living a genuine, authentic life that I could look back on and say it was because of that moment.
After that occurred, when did that manifest itself physically as an expedition of some description, modest or grand? 3 days in the Lake District or crossing the Atlantic. When did it really manifest itself?
Yeah, so the most significant thing that I did sort of in that sort of immediate-ish period of time after that moment was I ran across the Atacama Desert in Chile, it was actually a race. It was very similar to Marathon des Sables, which is in the Sahara.
But quite a lot higher.
Quite a lot higher, yes, a lot higher. Which was, one of the reasons why I wanted to do it actually is because it was sort of similar-ish, but a different challenge as a consequence of the altitude.
Let's be just straight about it. Is the hardest one, isn't it? Because you're dealing with altitude as well as climate, as well as length, correct?
Yes.
The ultramarathon.
Yes. It was 275 kilometers. It was over a series of 6 days. And it was 4 consecutive marathons over 4 consecutive days, followed by a double marathon on day 5, and then another half-ish marathon on day 6. But I think what makes it more challenging than maybe the other desert marathons is that it's at altitude. So I think the lowest we were at was around about 3,000 meters above sea level, and we're getting up to about 5,500 meters, which is the equivalent height of Mont Blanc. So, it's as high as, the highest mountain in Europe. But just different terrain as well. So,
Did you suffer?
Yeah. No, yes, significantly actually. Mainly with feet, as you would imagine. Conditions, during the day it was blisteringly hot, but because the humidity is kind of zero, there's literally no humidity at all, so it's super, super dry. So you don't get as affected by the heat because just your body's way of dealing with, basically evaporation is just much more efficient. But at night, it just got really, really cold as well. So it was sort of -5, -10. But yeah, I had massive issues with problems with my feet, blisters under toenails, having to drill through my toenails to drain out the pus from my toes. I had to slice my little toe open with a penknife because it had swollen so big. It was like bigger than my big toe. Someone advised me before I did the race to wear shoes that were 3 sizes too big for me because my feet would swell that much, which I thought was utterly ridiculous. But for once in my life, I took their advice. I think by the end of the first day, they were already too tight on my feet. So just my feet had swollen so much. I guess one because of the heat, but also just the pounding.
Where was your quit point on that race?
So we had to run across a salt flat. Salt flats are anything but flat. They're flat, but it's like running on, not that I've ever run on coral, but I imagine it's like running on coral, just crystallized salt, which is super, super sharp. But the problem is if you pierce the layer, you would go sort of knee or waist deep in just gooey, thick, kind of salty muck. Anyway, so we had to run across the salt flat, and I decided when I got to the side that if somebody told me that my wife and children were on the other side in serious trouble, and the only way I could rescue them is to retrace my steps back across the salt flat, I said I don't think I would. So, so maybe that was it. Maybe that was a quit point. It
sounds really unpleasant. What is it that you find so euphoric about that sense of achievement or horror? What is it?
It's a good question. Do you know what? I do genuinely love it. I genuinely think that you don't really discover who you are until you go beyond your own self-imposed and self-perceived capabilities, whether that be physical, mental, or emotional. And so I think once you start pushing that boundary, once you start stepping beyond that boundary, I think that fear, as you approach it, I think fear and concern and worry can prevent you from going any further. But I think it's at that point where it gets kind of interesting for me. It's at that point where I just want to go on and on and on. And the further you go, I guess, the more confidence you get that actually it's okay. Like you will suffer and you will find, things difficult, and whether it be physical or emotional. And but you sort of come out the other side, and then you look back and think, actually, I've moved on. But I think it's that moment maybe that exists between your self-perception and reality. It's that moment that's the interesting bit. I think that's
where self-perception and the next edge, because your reality, you're constantly shifting, whether it's the Atacama or the Atlantic, and I suspect you'll be on the moon before you're dead. But there is that, you're constantly pushing at your edge until the edge moves. It's not a static place for you.
Yeah,
what I find really interesting about what your work has involved is that you are you have the power to get to the edge and beyond, but you don't appear to be doing it out of a sense of competitive You don't want to be the first
No.
or to be the winner.
Yeah.
You never talk about that. And when we move on to discussing the Atlantic, you talk about team and listening to the team. And what is that? What is that about you that wants to do it for yourself and not necessarily... You don't need to be first through the line, do you?
No, I don't, and I don't. I kind of make a point of not trying to compete with others, because I just accept the fact that there's always going to be somebody out there better than me at whatever it is, and so I find competition a bit of a distraction, but also it's a security blanket as well, that one could justify one's own, say, achievements by saying, well, it's better than somebody else's. And you could ignore the fact that maybe somebody else is better than you, but you can find security in that. Whereas if I compete with anybody, it's with myself. I have this sort of thing in my mind. There's two versions. There's two me's. There's two Ians. There's Ian A, there's Ian B. And I've decided that Ian B is a better version than Ian A. That's not obviously how I frame it in my mind, but you know what I mean. And so I try and go through life being Ian B, and so... I guess it's beating Ian A. I suppose it's like, well, there's a version of me that's here, and there's a version of me that's here, and I think that's what I compete with.
Is Ian A or Ian B in the happy place? Where is this happy place with you?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and because I think most people might answer that by describing somewhere physical, like a physical location. And for me, it's more... I think it's more of a mindset. It's more and I think it's when your physical and your emotional and mental being kind of align with circumstances or conditions or a situation you're in. And where I've been, I guess, at my most happiest or euphoric have been moments that you don't try and force. You don't try and put yourself there. You don't say, well, this is my happy place in that armchair or on top of that mountain or on the beach or by the pool or whatever it might be. And so, because I think you sort of try and force yourself into a happy place, but you might not be happy, but you seem to just create this artificial world around you to feel that way. So for me, I think it's just finding myself in a situation. I think that's where that happy place for me is that sense of feeling truly alive, which exists between my perception, my perceived boundary, and what we were talking a moment or two ago about, like, what is my capability? And that's the gap, that's the difference. And I think when I'm in that space between the two, that's when I'm at my happiest, because I know that this is when it starts to get interesting. One of my favourite passages is Theodore Roosevelt's 1912, "Credit belongs to the man in the arena" quote, and I think that's as relevant today as it was 108 years ago. And because what that is all about, essentially, is that I guess everybody has the critic inside them as well as the doer of deeds inside them. But the critic can stand and observe and point out where they would have done it differently, or where the other person failed, or they could have done it better. But unless you're prepared to be that person, the doer of deeds, unless you're prepared to be the person in the arena doing the thing, then you will never truly know how it feels. Whether you succeed or fail, you'll never truly know what it feels like to be alive, essentially. And so, especially in the world of social media, where people tend to sort of scroll and observe and comment and, I wouldn't have done it like that, I'd have done it like this, or I could do it better, or whatever it may be. I think actually where you start to experience the emotions that we're talking about, which is fear and I guess nervousness and being scared and euphoria and all that sort of stuff, is actually just doing things. And I think once you become comfortable with understanding that actually success or failure is less important than the doing bit, the experience, then actually failing you don't worry about it, because actually doing is success in itself.
Expeditioning now has lost its team ethic in many ways. It's quite solo. It's quite solo-centric. Not the case when you're in a very small boat crossing the Atlantic, sharing intimacies that I wouldn't want to share in buckets. Talk me through that journey. What was the journey? When did you take it? How far did you go? And I think on day 5 you lost something, didn't you?
Yeah, so we were rowing across the Atlantic Ocean from the Canary Islands to Antigua, which is about 5,000 kilometres ish, depending how much zigzagging you do. And ahead of the expedition, I thought a lot about what I wanted to get out of the experience. And I thought a lot about, because what I didn't want to do is, because it was such a significant chunk of time, and I was going to be away over Christmas, effectively leaving, my family at home, and, I was basically going to be away for 2 months. And I just thought what I didn't want to do is step off the boat at the other side and with any regrets whatsoever. And so I decided the thing that I wanted to get most out of it is to be a certain person, is to be a certain way. And I think that teamwork is obviously super important, because you're relying upon each other to get yourself across an ocean. And if you think about it, 5,000 kilometers across the Atlantic Ocean in a very small rowing boat, exposed to the elements, it's, at first you think, well, is that really that possible? But, if you break it down into each individual component parts, you then start to go, well, actually, if we get this right and that right and this right, then it becomes possible. And so teamwork's really important. And so I had this thing in my mind, which was I was going to set 7 personal kind of mantras that I wrote on the side of the boat, which were just for myself. And it was stay calm, stay positive, stay present, never ever be late to the oars. I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. This is a privilege. Just recognize that what I'm doing is a privilege. Be respectful. And the other one was it's all about the team. Can
you remember a time when you really kind of wish you weren't there?
Yes. Yeah, it's interesting, because I suppose at that precise moment in time, you're too busy trying to find a way of coping with it, that you're focusing on a way to get through it as opposed to just dwelling on that moment. And so I think that what I tend to do is I find, ways of saying, right, okay, so I'm in a horrendous situation. Say, mid-Atlantic as a good example. I suffered with what I would have described as, extreme seasickness. I was projectile vomiting for 12 hours and everything. I didn't eat for the best part of a week. I was just not in a good place at all, and there was no escape. We're on a tiny, tiny boat, and it's not like there's no out at all, and you cannot get away from the very, very thing that is causing you such extreme discomfort. And I remember at the time getting slightly crazy, because even though the sort of rowing positions were open, at each end of the boat, we just had these tiny, tiny cabins, which were probably not that much bigger than that table, I guess, where you just had to curl up in a ball inside. And at night, in a storm, in the middle of the Atlantic, you're trying to get some sleep, because we're rowing 24 hours a day, 2 hours on, 2 hours off. And you're suffering with extreme seasickness, and it's cold, and you're hungry, and you're a long way from home, and you're on 10 kilometers depth of water. If you start to engage with all those things, then you'll very quickly spiral out of control and probably freak out. And so I think it's just the recognition, and this goes back to my sort of mantra points, is stay calm, first of all, just stay really, really calm. Secondly, and this sounds a bit weird, but this is a privilege. This is self-imposed. I'm fortunate enough to have put myself in this situation. So just put it in perspective. Is it real danger? Yeah, of course it is. There's a storm raging, and the waves against the side are it's like, not that I've ever tried to sleep in a washing machine, but it's imagine how a washing machine would be. But the noise is deafening as well. In fact, it's worse inside, because you're being deprived of the senses, because you can't see what's going on around you, and you're not out on deck. And so for me, then it just becomes about, well, what are the things that I can focus on? And the things that I can focus on are the things that I can control, And so it's then just going back to, it's then just basics. It's, are there other people on the boat with me? Yes, fortunately there were. Is there food? Yes, there is. Is there water? Yes, there is. And we did have a very difficult time where we lost power on night 5, which we never fully recovered, actually, which basically just added to the whole kind of adventure and experience, because we ended up having to spend a lot of time navigating by stars and the moon and the sun and all that type of stuff, and manually steering and everything. So that just added, I guess, to the adventure. When we lost the power at that moment, it was a bit of, you've always got to look for ways. of progress, and however small it is, have I made progress? Am I moving forwards? Now, if the situation is really bad, you could argue that actually even just going sideways, even just staying still is actually good progress as opposed to going backwards. And so I think actually trying to find comfort in, just, one more step. Let's think about it in one more step. Let's think about it then. And I heard Ben Saunders actually talk about, so he's a polar explorer, talk about his coping strategies when he was approaching just his quit point. He couldn't take any more. And it was just get the ski, just get the tip of one ski in front of the tip of the other ski, and then, or giving you permission to quit at a later point in time. So that's something else that I would do as well. I would say, well, let's embrace it. Let's embrace the fact that I'm finding it difficult. Maybe I'm having thoughts of I just can't go on, but give myself permission to think about it. Maybe it's let's get to that point over there, and then think about it.
Yeah, but let's get to that point over there. Is getting to the core, I think, of everything you do, and I can only admire it. It's optimism. It's optimism. There's a better thing waiting if you get past that quit point. And you feel that when you're in nature. You feel that when you're physically against yourself. You don't feel it when you're in a box with a mobile phone. And that's the to me, that's the lesson of your story, is that you've lived a life of optimism. Which is something that is in short supply. Ian, explain to me this phrase, which I've heard you say before. Never, ever be late to the oars.
Yeah, so I wrote down on the boat, on the side of the boat, just in my own handwriting in a tiny space in the cabin, which was never, ever be late to the oars. And that was my commitment to myself to ensure that I would be effectively the best version of myself, because we were rowing 24 hours a day, 2 hours on, 2 hours off. And if you're the person in the rowing seat, and it could be 2:00 in the morning, 2:00 in the afternoon, you could be suffering, very hungry, in a lot of pain, desperately fighting sleep and fatigue, that if the other person that's due on the next shift is not ready to go, isn't there at the right time, then even if it's only 10 seconds, let alone a minute, 5 minutes or 10 minutes, that's only going to eat away at their morale. And if it eats away at their morale, then it's going to have an impact on team dynamics and that sort of stuff. And so rather than it being a team thing, because I didn't want to project that onto the team, there was a commitment. I guess it was my commitment to the team that I'd never ever be late to the oars. And so I think that's how that transfers in the rest of my life, is that never ever be late. Never be the one that is late or flaky or backing out of things. Just always be the rock, basically. And so, but I'm far from perfect. So it was just my commitment to myself to give it my best go.
Well, Ian, I'm going to be writing that above the bed of my child. Never ever be late to the oars. Thanks very much.
Pleasure. That was great. Thank you.